Namaste, and welcome to tonight's Vicharamantan Fireside Conversation, where we will be exploring whether the UK is going to face a water crisis. My name's Pragna, and I'll be your chair for this evening. For those of you who are new to the platform, the name Vicharamantan, or VM for short, is a Sanskrit phrase which translates to the churning of ideas. The organisation exists to spotlight those issues that are most pertinent to British society and evaluate them through the lens of sustainability. We do this by engaging with individuals or institutions who are experts in their fields. Our aim is to explore ideas earnestly. We are not here to provide solutions, rather we get the conversation started, ask questions, and give you the opportunity to challenge the ideas, which you can manthan yourself. By way of a brief agenda, today's fireside will start with opening comments from our speaker before we start our manthan or discussion, followed by audience Q&A. So as the discussion takes place, I invite you to engage with our speaker by posting your comments and questions via YouTube chat. We need water to survive, but it also fuels a country's innovation, trade, and economic success. Global population growth has seen a corresponding growth in industrialization and economic development, which has led to increased water consumption and transformation of ecosystems, leading to loss of biodiversity. By 2050, water demand is expected to increase by over 50% globally. It's been described as the next oil in terms of its value as global resource. In the UK, the chief executive of the Environment Agency has warned that the UK will run out of water within 25 years due to climate change and population growth leading to increased demand. What are the ramifications of us not taking action? How does policy govern our water consumption? And how can we build a sustainable water sector that is beneficial to society and minimises harm to the environment in the long run? To help us answer some of these questions, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Heather Smith, lecturer in water governance at Cranfield Water Science Institute. Heather's research interests include the relationship between governance and resilience. Recent projects have examined the emergence of new technologies and approaches in the sector and how these fit with existing governance frameworks and the perceptions of end users. Heather, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, delighted to be here.
Heather, for your opening remarks, please could you spend a few minutes defining what a water crisis is and how has the UK ended up in a situation where we may run out of water in 25 years, given that we are an island surrounded by it?
Yes, well, thanks for the invitation this evening. Well, it's important to understand that it may not exactly be running out of water. When the Environment Agency talks about us hitting a water crisis, they're really talking about the two trends you mentioned. When they first presented this concept, they presented a graphic that showed supplies going down and demand going up. And there's a distinct point at which those lines cross, where demand will then exceed supply. And so it's not that exactly we'll run out, it's that our demand, if nothing changes, our demand will exceed the resources we have available. And so the reason we're in this situation is that it comes down to the two trends you mentioned. Supplies are effectively going down because of climate change and because of shifts in policy to prioritize the environment and to reduce our abstractions from the environment. And demand is going up as a result of population growth and changing cultural habits around the use of water. So again, the point of the Environment Agency was if nothing changes, and that's one of their key phrases, if nothing changes, we could quite soon hit that point where our demand exceeds our supply, and we'll start to have much greater insecurity.
Thank you very much. Very fascinating insight. So let's move on to what are the main consequences of us running out of water. So let's start with individuals and communities and then move on to the economy.
Well, the consequences for individuals will be, there could be many things, and it could vary drastically across the country. So obviously those regions that are more water stressed are in the south and the southeast, and that's where the challenge will occur the quickest, and because that's also where a lot of the population growth is occurring. So if we start to reach this point, we'll start to see probably more enforced restrictions on the use of water, and many people will be familiar with hosepipe bans, which is one form of restriction. During a more extreme drought of, I think it was in the 1960s or 70s, there were stand pipes. People had to queue at stand pipes to be able to get water. So there was much more strict rationing. So that type of thing could start to become more common, particularly during the hot summer months. And the other thing that could happen is if the water companies start to shift to different forms of resource. So one of the ways of adapting to this is to invest in things like in alternative water supplies like desalination or wastewater recycling. That can have some knock-on effects of they can be more reliable and more secure in the face of climate change. But particularly desalination can also be more expensive. So we might start to see some increases in the costs associated with water. And that will, to lead on to your second question, will have ramifications for the economy. If water becomes more expensive, this is something we'll have to adjust to. Water is a foundation for business as well as for home life, and there will need to be there will need to be a dramatic shift, I think, in how heavy users of water conduct their businesses and need to become much more efficient in the use of water for certain industries. And there may just have to be a cost that potentially gets passed on to customers if water becomes more expensive. That could have knock-on implications for the cost of food and for the cost of products that are more water intensive.
And so we obviously import a lot of our goods from elsewhere. And so I just wanted to ask if these countries also faced water crisis or water shortages, would we become vulnerable? And how would that look, for example, to the cost of an average basket of goods for a household?
Yes, absolutely. And it's something we've already seen. I mean, there have been cases where, in a lot of the produce we get from Europe, for instance, fresh produce can suffer from, shortages in water, but also extremely hot periods or extremely cold periods. So there have been times where changes in the growing season or lack of water at the key part of the growing season has resulted in shortages of particular products, food products, things like cucumbers and that, which then either leads to a lack of those products on the shelves, or if they are there, then they can become slightly more expensive. So yes, for the produce we do import, if we're importing from countries that rely heavily on irrigation, and certain products that rely quite heavily on irrigation, then those products, we will see some added costs to those, or scarcity of them, one or the other.
Okay, yeah. So moving on to policy and governance. So could you just outline the relationship between the government regulating bodies and the water companies?
Mm-hmm. Sure. As you may be aware, the water companies in the UK, or I should say in England, are private companies. Which is actually unusual. There aren't many water sectors around the world that are fully privatized the way the sector in England is fully privatized, and that means that the companies own all the infrastructure as well as run the services. But they aren't allowed to do that in a vacuum. They are heavily regulated. And the main regulatory body that governs their activities is a regulator called Ofwat, as you might expect, Office of Water. And they are the economic regulator for the water sector. And that means they, at the national level, control, roughly speaking, how much the water companies are allowed to charge for their tariffs, and they govern what they're allowed to spend money on. So every 5 years, and we call these price review cycles, every 5 years, the water companies submit their business plans to Ofwat, and those cover what things they're going to spend money on, in terms of infrastructure or developing new resources, and what they're going to charge prices, tariffs for their services. And Ofwat then determines whether those are okay, essentially, and they can adjust them up or down depending on their findings. We've just come through a price review cycle, and the results of it were quite interesting, actually, because Ofwat came down quite hard on the water companies this year, or it was last year, and they essentially forced them to spend more but charge less, to try and put in more efficiencies, more savings and things. So and a lot of the water companies, well, not a lot, 4 water companies actually challenged this, and they challenged this on the grounds of some of the issues we're talking about. So the water companies have a duty to try and promote resilience in the sector and to make the services more resilient. And they argued that Ofwat's cuts to their tariffs were not enabling them to have the resources they needed to be able to do that. So there's an interesting, there's a decision that's been made about that, which essentially found halfway in between Ofwat's position and the water company's position, more or less. But it makes for some, if you're interested in these things, it makes for some fascinating reading, but I won't go into detail.
Since I've been researching it, definitely.
So so Ofwat is they're in an interesting position in after this particular price review cycle. But that's roughly the relationship we have, where we have a national regulator for the economic side of the sector, and the companies then determining their own activities.
And how is our water usage measured? So, for example, we see the figure 140 litres per person. Is that kind of the water that we use every day? And is that taking into account kind of the water that we can't see, if you like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So that's the common figure you see, that everybody on average uses 140 litres per person per day. But that is an average. That is so. Actually, they've worked out. It's a sort of estimated average based on how much goes into, how much they can measure, how much goes into networks, and roughly how many people are live within that network area. So it is just a very rough average, and it's based on a lot of assumptions. And now what they're finding, so now that water companies are investing in technology like smart metering, where they can get a lot more data about the specifics of how households use water, they're able to tell that actually the real average for domestic water use is probably a fair bit lower than that. and that the overall average of 140 is potentially slightly skewed by a relatively small number of very big users. So it is very much an average, and the kind of average household is probably lower than 140 liters per person per day.
Yeah, could you just, so I just asked about the water that we can't see. So things, I think it's called virtual water or embedded water. Could you just define these terms for us, please?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, the 140 is based on what they can measure that goes into the network, more or less. And obviously there is a lot of ways we use water that aren't measured by that metric. So there's the water that goes into growing our food, into making our clothes, into making our electronic devices, materials, the materials that build our houses and roads, and most of these things have some component of water in them. So, one of the most, I think mobile phones are one of the most water intensive things, or creating microchips actually uses a fair bit of water. So there are a lot of as you say, it's embedded water or virtual water, we'll call it. A lot of hidden ways that we use water that aren't necessarily measured by that 140 figure.
Very interesting fact. I think, yeah, definitely food for thought. So moving on to kind of, this chief executive of the environment agencies, when you talked about we may run out of water, or, a bit exaggerated, but we may, if nothing changes. When the UK is looking to managing this, do they draw on examples from around the world? And do you have any examples that you can draw from? And what was implemented in these places? And what can the UK learn from these examples?
Yeah. So one example that has been often looked at is the city of Perth in Australia. So they're a very dry city, and they used to rely heavily on surface water and water flowing into their reservoirs. And they went through a period, and I've seen they've published the graphs on this, and it's the water that they were measuring that was going into their reservoirs. It just goes like this over about a 50-year period. And it was quite stark. And so they realized, well, the writing is on the wall, we can't continue this. So they had to invest in alternative resources. And so they invested in desalination, in wastewater recycling for drinking and non-drinking purposes. And they invested in things like what we call water-sensitive urban development. So different ways of building and developing the city that have less of an impact on water resources. And there was a shift in how people used it as well. And because they had invested heavily in these alternative resources, there was a cost implication to that. And in that the water did become more expensive. But in general, it seemed like the residents of Perth accepted this, and there wasn't really any other option. And so the city adapted, and they've got a very different mix of water sources that they use now, and very different ways of using water. But it's worked in that they haven't hit the same kind of crisis point that has been heard from cities like Cape Town famously faced a few years ago, or the city of Chennai in India faced not long ago, where they had what they call day zero points, where they were facing the prospect of actually having to turn off the central distribution system for water because they simply had run out of supply. And so, yeah, the UK, I think, is trying to learn both from these relatively successful examples like Perth, but also these more challenging examples in terms of what sorts of things to expect and what kinds of systems they can look to adapt.
Yeah, we look forward to hearing about them soon, hopefully. So before we move on, I'd just like to remind our viewers to keep sending your comments and questions via YouTube chat function. I'll be posting your questions to Heather shortly. So you mentioned resilience earlier. So could you define resilience in regards to the water sector and how a resilient water model might look?
Yeah, that's what we call $1 million question, that one, because it's the water sector has been trying very hard to define resilience for quite a few years now. Yeah, so it's like sustainability, I guess. The concept of sustainability itself is very hard to define and means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I suppose for a long time, the water sector has seen resilience from a very technical engineering focused standpoint, where it's about how if a system breaks, how quickly can it return to service? And that was the kind of main concept of resilience. So if there was an outage, how quickly could services resume? That was their most sort of common measure of how resilient the system was. I think more recently, the thinking has expanded beyond that, where it's about how the overall system deals with change and stress. And it's not in the wake of a stressful event, like a drought, for instance, or a flood. It's not just about how quickly that system returns to its normal function. It's how that system might learn and adapt to become better and better attuned to the new realities it's having to live with. So yeah, a system, by that kind of understanding, you could argue that Perth is an example of potentially of a resilient system. They could see, they had enough evidence to see that the change was happening, that this stressful situation was on the horizon, and they adapted. You know, they worked out what they could do to adapt it, and they implemented changes before it became too much of a problem. And there was a collective action around that, and as a result, they've changed and become better effectively. So that's, I think, where the thinking now is around resilience. But it is still a much debated term. So this is my understanding of resilience. I like the wider concept, but I'm certainly not going to claim that everybody accepts the same definition.
Okay, and so you touched a little bit on sustainability as well. So what, in your view, what does sustainability mean in the water sector? Similar to resilience?
Yeah, I think it's similar. I think both are very long-term concepts. So a sustainable system is one where the services can continue for the long term, you know, for future generations. And so that again needs it needs an understanding of when things are going wrong. There needs to be a widespread recognition of when problems are arising. And there needs to be a sort of collective effort around how to adjust so that the system can continue, but without undue impacts on the environment or, you know, society, you know, in a way that doesn't undermine our environment and doesn't negatively impact particularly the most vulnerable people in society.
And so in terms of like sustainable models, I mean, you brought up desalination plants earlier because, you know, we're surrounded by seawater. Will they maybe become necessary if our freshwater reserves are depleted? And you mentioned that they're quite, intensive, like energy intensive. What other challenges might they bring?
Yeah, it's a possibility. I mean, it's a intuitively appealing prospect. As you say, we're an island surrounded by water, so for a lot of people, that it's an appealing answer that we just resort to desalination. And certainly, we wouldn't be the first. There are many countries around the world that have invested very heavily in desalination, and it may become necessary. I mean, the UK already does have at least one desalination plant, which is only sort of used in case of emergency because the water operating it is quite expensive. So But now investing heavily in desalination now sits at odds with the UK's climate change targets and carbon neutrality targets. And it sits at odds with the water sector's own commitments to carbon neutrality, which are quite, so they've committed to net zero carbon by 2035, I think. That's a water sector wide commitment. So because desalination is so energy intensive and so carbon intensive, it doesn't fit well with that agenda anymore. And then there's the cost implications. So in terms of making the water more expensive. So it is something that is known could be a stopgap or could be a measure if needed. And certainly if it was seen as the only feasible option, which for many countries it is seen as the only feasible option, then we would go down that road. But I think there's hesitation because of the environmental impact and the climate change impact.
Okay, so a quick reminder that you still have time to ask your questions via YouTube chat. We'll be moving on to Q&A shortly. So Heather, I'd like to move on to societal habits. So I read in a survey by the Great British Rain Paradox that highlighted that reducing water consumption ranks lowest in comparison to other environmental concerns like plastic pollution, energy consumption and carbon footprint. So in your view, what do you think the reason for this is?
I think it's because we're lucky enough to live in a country where water services are not a problem. We have some of the most reliable and safe water services, and as a result of that, people don't tend to think about them unless they go wrong. So it's just a sort of byproduct of the fact that we do have quite good services, and it becomes one of those hidden things that you don't have to think about too much. And even the bills, because most people pay everything through direct debit and things like that. The money just disappears. You don't tend to think about what you're where it's going. So it's because it's so easy that it becomes very hidden.
And how do you think our current societal habits impact the progress towards a sustainable relationship with water?
Well, it's fascinating actually. So the figure you quoted earlier, the 140 liters per person per day, that's been a relatively steady average for quite a while. Although it seems to be starting to increase again now, and partly that's due to the effects of COVID, and people are using. It's been sort of quite widely understood now. People are using more water for hygiene purposes. Doing more hand washing and bathing and clothes washing. But as I say, up until that point, it had been relatively steady for quite a while. But it was quite a drastic increase from sort of a few decades earlier. And a lot of that is down to things like bathing habits. The shift towards daily showering is a common habit, or the frequency and habits around washing dishes, external use. So garden use is one of the fastest growing sources of water consumption. So there are a lot of cultural habits embedded in how we use water, and there's been a lot of change in our expectations around how and when we can use water that have certainly over several decades brought that use up considerably.
And could we make certain shifts in our habits to kind of reduce our consumption?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, there are certain things. The most common example would be things like taking slightly shorter showers. Then you're saving not just water but also energy because of the hot water use. Not letting, similarly, I was astonished actually to find out how the proportion of people who still wash dishes just by letting the tap run, not filling the sink, just letting the tap run and washing dishes under a running tap.
I'm very guilty of that, yeah.
Yes. So that's one, small changes like that. If you fill the sink instead of letting the tap run, Again, it's both a water and an energy saver, that one. And you know, collecting rainwater, it's quite easy to install water butts now to collect rainwater to use during the summer months. So there are lots of different ways that people can, you know, people can use their water. And I think having, one of the things they were pushing last spring, so during the first lockdown, you may recall it was during a very hot period. And people were immediately, because of the combination of home working and this really hot period and not being able to leave the house, everybody got out paddling pools. And the water companies, several water companies were pleading with people, just don't fill your paddling pool because we haven't got enough water in the network. It just completely threw all their network modeling out the window. But, you know, so thinking twice about filling the paddling pool, or what you do with the water from the paddling pool, you know, don't just dump it, see if you can water some plants with it or something, you know. So there are some subtle shifts in thinking, I think, that people can do.
Yeah, totally agree. So many cultures around the world hold the view that, you know, we're all part of nature, and therefore we have a responsibility towards it, to protect it, to ensure we minimize harm towards it. And we should be mindful of how much we consume and how we use nature's resources, you know, including water. So, for example, in India, the rivers Ganga and Yamuna have been given all corresponding rights, duties, and liabilities of a living person. And so damaging them is legally equivalent to harming a person. And this reflects the view in Hindu tradition of treating the earth as a mother or goddess. So going out of our way to protect and serve her. But this worldview is also shared by other sort of indigenous cultures. For example, like the Maori tribes in New Zealand, I think recently a river and a mountain has been granted the same legal rights as a human being, which reflects their worldview. And in Ecuador, their constitution enshrines nature's right to integral respect. So is there anything to be learned from these examples with respect to the UK?
Absolutely, and the personhood of water, the legal personhood of water, I think is a fascinating area. I think there's a river in Canada as well that has recently been awarded that status, and I think it does. The difficulty I find is that although those sorts of traditions, I think, have a real different ethic towards the natural environment and make people think about the impact on the natural environment and rivers and natural water features. But I think one of the challenges is people are still quite divorced from that when they're turning on their taps. So even if you have that ethic towards your local river, you might not necessarily equate your local river with the water that's coming out of your tap, and see the connection in terms of the impact. So absolutely, I think there is a lot to learn from those sorts of cultures that embrace this view of the natural world, and I think there's a lot of value in that. But equally, I think there's a lot we can learn just in terms of that connection to what's actually coming out of our tap, and actually seeing that is still part of the natural environment, even though it's quite heavily removed from it.
Yeah. So, what do you think? What impact does education have on human behaviours towards water consumption, or is it down to policy and governance?
Well, I think it's a little of both. I mean, I think there is clearly a role for education, and a lot. I've seen so much of the water companies now doing outreach activities for schools, and I think that's incredibly valuable. We were making use of many of those during homeschooling, the times of homeschooling, for instance. And yeah, so instilling that at a young age, not just an understanding of the natural environment of water, but also the processes involved with cleaning water and bringing it to your tap and then taking it away again after it's been through the toilet. You know, all of these things I think are vitally important to connect people more closely again with the water services and making that connection to the water environment. But yes, there is also a role for policy, and so one of the things that is likely to come out in the government's new environment strategy, or which we were hoping to see, was clearer targets and very ambitious targets around reducing that 140 figure. They were trying to, in some areas, bring it down to 110, or even some councils were hoping for 90 liters per person per day as a target for things like new developments and new buildings. And so, even though those are averages, the ambition itself set in policy, I think, is what sets the tone for developers and for local authorities to try and create a new kind of awareness of the impact of new development on the water environment.
Yeah, education does really have an important role to play.
Absolutely.
So we're going to move on to audience Q&A. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We've got a lot, so I'll try and whiz through. So if you could keep your answers brief, Heather, that would be really appreciated.
I'll do my best.
Okay, so we've got a question from Manjalika. To what degree will water play a role in our geopolitical future? Will there be wars over water?
Oh, you want me to keep my answers brief? That's an excellent question. And in short, I think, yes, in the future, probably it will play more of a role. I think we're already starting to see it. It has in the past already, but in water-stressed areas of the world, it's going to become even more pronounced, I think.
Okay. Nice, sweet, short and sweet.
Yes.
So question from Dinay. Are there any incentives in place to ensure that water companies in England abstract water sustainably? What does that even look like?
Yes, so yes, there are. And I wouldn't say incentives, but there are regulations. And so the Environment Agency regulates how water companies can abstract from the environment. And they are putting in place what are called sustainability reductions. So many water companies are facing these reductions where the Environment Agency is saying you have to take less for environmental reasons. Whether it's probably arguable whether the amount that the Environment Agency allows is still sustainable, but they are actually saying at least you have to try and cut back. And so that is factoring into the new round of water resource plans that the water companies are doing. They have to account for the fact that they will not be allowed to take as much water from the environment. And for particularly sensitive ecosystems like chalk streams and things like that, it's going to hopefully have a big impact in maintaining the sustainability of those systems.
Yeah. We've got a question from Brother. We've focused a lot on the supply side issues. With respect to demand, are there sufficient incentives for example, individuals and industry to reduce consumption? So kind of following on from the last question.
Yeah, sufficient incentives, probably not, would be my feeling. I think there are initiatives. So a lot of the water companies, they are required to invest in demand management. And in the way they do their resource planning, they have to basically figure out how much resource they can save through demand management before they work out how much new supply they might need, for instance. And so there are mechanisms and programs that the water companies use to try and encourage customers to reduce their demand. Managing leakage is one of the key things to reducing demand, because we do have quite old and quite leaky infrastructure. And so there are a number of mechanisms in place. Again, whether they are enough, I would say probably not, and we could do quite a lot more, I think, to encourage more demand management.
Yeah. So we've got a question from Vishuddhi. So what are the technological challenges within the water industry? There must be a lot.
Oh gosh, yeah, there are a lot. I mean, so I do a lot of work on things like wastewater recycling, for instance, and perceptions of that. But technology exists to do that, but improving that technology, so turning basically the technology to turn sewage back into drinking water, the technology does exist, but is somewhat difficult sometimes. So trying to improve on that, I guess, is one of the challenges. The carbon neutrality targets I mentioned, that's quite a significant challenge. So reducing the amount of energy it takes to treat water and to treat sewage in particular. So wastewater treatment is probably the single biggest energy user in the sector. And recovering other sorts of resources. So there's a big shift now to see sewage as a resource, and even some of the byproducts of drinking water treatment as resources, and to be able to recover those resources and use them for different applications. That's a big technological interest area as well.
So we've got a question from Michaela. What impact might desalination have on ocean ecosystems? There's been a lot of publicity. Yeah. I don't know if you've watched the documentary Seaspiracy, so there's a lot of focus on the ocean, and so what impact might a desalination plant have on ecosystems in the ocean?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think so in terms of volume, I don't think much, because honestly, the amount that we can draw from desalination plants is literally a drop in the bucket compared to the amount in the ocean. However, obviously, when the desalination process, as the name implies, it takes salt out of the water, and that salt becomes what's called a brine. So the leftover salt is quite toxic, and it needs to be disposed of. And so that's one of the more sort of expensive parts of the desalination process, is what they typically have to do is put it back out to sea. And that can be quite polluting. The byproducts of desalination can be quite polluting for the sort of immediate ocean environment if the brine is not treated and disposed of correctly or effectively. So there are some knock-on implications there.
And we've got a question from Mitesh. Do we need to educate the public on the links between general consumption of goods and services and the link to water usage?
Yes, absolutely. And there's been a lot of talk about how to do that. So one of my colleagues works a lot in this virtual water, embedded water field, and particularly the embedded water within agricultural products. And he's done some comparisons. And so, yeah, the way we shop for food can have a big impact on the sort of water consumption that goes along with it. And I think I told you guys, one of the products he singled out as having some of the highest, there being one of the most water intensive products, was basmati rice. So these sorts of, changing shopping habits can affect kind of virtual water use, but how to communicate that is a big challenge, because the obvious thing is to have some sort of labeling system on products, but there's already so many labeling systems on products, it becomes a lot of noise. So I think what a lot of supermarkets have done is try to kind of create more of a brand identity around, okay, well, we look at our supply chains and we sort of try and make sure that there's less water use within our supply chain in general as a supermarket. Like Sainsbury's is quite active in that space, for instance. I've never done work for them. I'm not sponsored by Sainsbury's. But they do quite a lot of that sort of research. And so I think that's kind of where things seem to be headed, rather than down a labeling route, because I think that the feeling is there's just too much information on food products already.
Okay, and I think that's enough questions for you, Heather.
Good questions.
Yeah, very excellent questions. Thank you very much to everybody who's submitted them. So before we close, please could you share your concluding comments and thoughts that you would like to leave our viewers with in regards to water consumption, and ultimately what is the future of water sustainability?
Yeah. Well, I think what I would love to encourage people to do is to communicate more with their water companies. So, obviously there are things people can do around the house to use less and to think differently about how water is used. And that's great if people can engage in that. But, water companies at the moment are actively engaged in the early stages of planning for the future of their water resources. So they're going into a new round of water resource management planning. And there's always public consultations that go along with that. So if you feel that, if you want to see your water company investing in alternative supplies or water sensitive urban development or other forms of initiatives for demand management, talk to them about it. They love to have customer consultations. So it's really important that we have this conversation. I mean, your group is all about conversation, and conversations between water companies and their customers, I think, are hugely important to try and work out together what's the most sustainable way forward for water services. So if there's one thing I could leave people with, it's have a look at what your water company is doing and get involved. Talk to them about it.
Thank you very much, Heather. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on our platform, and we wish you the best in all your future endeavours.
Thanks. It's been great fun.
I hope this fireside has given you, our viewers, food for thought to evaluate your own water consumption and relationship with the environment. I encourage you to take your thoughts and questions to friends, family and communities and water companies to keep the conversation going after we log off tonight. You can continue the dialogue with us via any of our social media platforms. You'll find the links shared below. Aside from joining our live discussions, there are a number of great ways to get involved with VM. First of all, there's our VM podcast series, which is available across all major audio streaming platforms and on our website at vijayaramanthan.org/podcast. We also have our fantastic weekly book clubs across the country, which provide another great space to earnestly explore and discuss ideas. For details on how to attend your nearest book club, visit our website on vijayaramanthan.org/book club. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our well-wishers, without whom our work would not be possible. If anyone watching would like to support our efforts, please use the QR code displayed on the screen or use the link posted in the comments section, which will take you to a PayPal page. To become a regular contributor, click the monthly donation box. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the bell icon, where you'll be notified when a new discussion is available to stream. To hear about our events in advance, sign up to our mailing list at vijayaramanthan.org/mailing list. And finally, I'm pleased to announce our next event on Saturday, 12th of June at 7 p.m, where we'll be exploring whether schools are responsible for building character. We look forward to seeing you then. Good evening and namaste.